of public policy and administration. So her research examines public sector reform, policy making, and civic engagement, focusing in particular on impact and role of digital in these domains. So she'll be talking to us today about transforming digital government in Ontario. Welcome.
Yeah, you can see.
Thank you. It's really great to be here, and I'm very excited to, well, I like observing how these events unfold, and similar to the Ottawa event, but maybe a more varied crowd. Most people at the public, the Ottawa Civic Technics are public servants, because everybody in Ottawa is public servants, so I always like the diversity of the Toronto crowd. So what I wanted to talk about today, kind of briefly, and then hopefully have a good conversation about with all of you, is some of the changes that are underway right now in the Ontario government specifically. And gosh, I'm trying to think back when these were first announced. You'll know, Matthew, because you were coming.
2016, July 2016.
Oh no, I mean like the act and the budget. It was March. April. Okay, great. Thank you. So basically, back in April, there was an announcement through the budget bill that the Ontario government was going to be introducing a new piece of legislation called the Simpler, Better, Faster Services Act. Those are all great adjectives, so who could be not excited about that? But as people in the digital government community started observing this, there was a lot of, I think, justified excitement, but also some confusion and some outrage in some cases. So I wrote a few blog posts just sort of unpacking what seemed to be some of the issues on the horizon and what we might want to be excited about with some of these changes. So I thought I'd kind of cover some of those today and then put a few things on the agenda for us to think about. Because I do think that this legislative change and what it potentially entails for governments in Ontario is something that we should all be paying a lot more attention to. So the first thing is that the piece of legislation was basically involves a whole range, for those who aren't familiar, a whole range of potential policy changes, not only to how sort of data is governed and used in the province, both within the public sector, but also in the private sector, actors who are implicated in service delivery, but also who that data is shared with, how it can be used, applied in digital service design. It mandates things like user research for service development. And all of these powers are to be sort of implemented through a new role that was created, a deputy minister level position, so high-ranking official, the chief digital and data officer, who would operate out of the Ontario Digital Service. Now, I think one thing to keep in mind here is that it wasn't just a sort of directive or kind of like policy. We had lots of those on digital and data within government over the years, and the experience that I've had and that others have had is that largely they're ignored. They don't have a lot of teeth, and departments kind of go, oh, that sounds like a nice thing to do. Maybe one day we'll think about user research, or maybe one day we'll think about investing in digital skills, or thinking about how we govern our data, but it's never high priority. I think the interesting thing about the Act is that it actually has legislative teeth, so it mandates, there's a lot of shall statements. It tells ministries what they have a legal responsibility to do in terms of how they manage their data. So we should be paying attention to it for that reason in the first place. I think the other thing that makes this important to all of us is that, you probably know this if you work in the tech space, but to many who are working in government, they've kind of been marginalizing and ignoring digital and data and its centrality to governance for a long time. But I think this act helps remind us that when you change how you think about digital and data in government, you actually change government writ large. And increasingly the way you approach those two dynamics, or those two areas within the state, shape what's possible and what's not, the role of citizens in governing, where power and accountability lies, and this act kind of starts to unpack that and lay that out in a way that's never been done so explicitly. So that's what the act is and what it does and why it matters. The second thing that I want to put on the radar is, on the radar, is sort of, okay, now what? So how is this being implemented? There's huge questions of whether the Ontario government is even in a position to make some of the changes that are mandated. So things like making it obligatory to do user research when designing services. That demands access to a ton of skills that are just not in the current sort of workforce in government. And as you may or may not know, there's a hiring freeze in the Ontario Public Service. So there's some tension in mandating these vast changes to how data will be used and how the service will be designed and delivered, and not then resourcing it. And we see this tension arise in a lot of contexts where you get a government that comes in and they're really excited about digital in particular as a way to save money and shrink the size of the state without acknowledging that actually having a strong digital government often demands quite a bit of investment and demands that you hire quite a few people. So that's one that I'm not too sure about on the implementation side. The biggest issue though that I think we should be paying attention to is less the, logistical question of how you do this is fascinating, but the big one is democratic legitimacy. So how do we actually make sure that these policy changes have sufficient social license to be acceptable to Ontarians and to adhere to kind of broader principles of public sector democratic governance, so transparency, equity, procedural fairness. One red flag here that is the process by which some of these changes are being introduced. So there's been a lot of pushback from the community of folks who are paying attention to data governance in the public sector, who've basically said, there was a consultation that seemed to happen earlier this year, but then suddenly in a budget bill you announced that you're going to make all these vast changes to how data is governed and used in the province, and you're creating this new role in this Chief Digital Data Officer. How does that relate to the consultation you just did? Just kind of like consultation 101 is don't ask people things that you then are just going to ignore or act on without even having responded to the consultation. It seems very rushed. Sneaking policy changes that are this vast in scope and potentially transform the entire machinery of the public service and how our data are harnessed and used in the role of the private sector in delivering services. Sneaking that into an omnibus budget bill is generally not best practice in terms of kind of robust, transparent democratic governance because the budget bill was going to pass. There were a lot of things to scrutinize in the budget bill, and it meant that the digital and data piece was largely ignored by the opposition because there's just so many other things to do. You'll remember Stephen Harper was regularly criticized for using omnibus budget bills. This is another great example of that in play. I think the other challenge that stakeholders are finding is now there's been a few, just recently, this last month, basically, a consultation paper, a discussion paper released, which I'm excited about in terms of some of the framing, but also there's a question of just like, end of the summer, people are on vacation, or when they're preparing for back to school is like a hard time. Some have said on Twitter, oh, this is great, this is a good example of how to do consultation, there's like 5 weeks to respond. But my response was like, oh wow, I really wish I had more time to deal with this, and I'm prepping for back to term, and like I'm at the cottage next week. You might be saying, well, get over yourself, But hey, come on, be realistic here. You can't ask people to. It's not the most robust process of consultation. You don't give people a lot of time, and you're not thoughtful about schedules. Also, all of these changes are apparently going to happen by the end of this year, which is amazing to see, I guess, government move that quickly, but also incredibly worrisome because nothing should happen. These kinds of changes should not happen that quickly. And if the consultation and engagement with the community is actually going to be taken seriously, it's very hard for me to see how you could deliver something, the kinds of policy changes envisioned by the end of the year. So the outside community is kind of scratching their head and saying, why is this being rushed? Like, what are you pushing through that you don't want us to know about, or what's the pressure to move so quickly on these changes, which again, really potentially drastically reform the relationship between citizens and government, how government internally is organized, who delivers our service, who has access to data describing the intimate details of our lives. And then I think another kind of democratic accountability red flag that I would raise tonight is specifically on some of the data governance questions. And this is I think the next frontier of important research in digital government and important policy in digital government, where we're actually starting to see digital government happen at scale. The transformation that we've been pushing for in the community of people who care about this for the past 10 years or so, through things like this act, is actually coming to fruition. Governments are really changing how they view digital and data as a kind of part of governing. But this raises huge questions about how we want our data collected and by who should have access to those data, the role of the private sector, whether we want data monetized. We can think of a few examples recently where people have really pushed back against digital reforms. Things like StatsCan trying to compel data from banks, and Canadians were outraged, and so that initiative was canned. Obviously, the big hot button one right now would be what's happening with Sidewalk Lab's proposal for Toronto's Quayside region. I think justifiably a lot of citizen pushback. But we might start to see in Ontario significant pushback if the current digital and data reforms are pushed through in a similarly kind of rushed manner without first securing social license, without first understanding what people are comfortable with in this space. And what's at risk there is, on the one hand, the good things that could come out of these reforms may not come to fruition because significant citizen pushback could mean that a minister or a premier is like, whoa, actually I don't agree with what this act is trying to do. So you lose the potential to make some important changes to how the Ontario government is using digital data. But the bigger issue is probably that you can kind of break the social compact and citizens' trust in the state as a kind of responsible data steward and someone, an organization that they can turn to and trust could really be eroded if you just kind of ran through policy changes in terms of how government thinks about data and delivers our services. So that's sort of just to give you a quick and dirty breakdown of what I see some of the big issues and why hopefully we can all start paying more attention. And the first way we could do this is by reading the discussion paper that's out right now, which is the first of 3 that will be released in the next few months with a view to informing these massive policy changes that will really potentially transform the governance of Ontario as a province, all before January 1st. So that's a big one. Thanks.
So are there any questions for Amanda? Maybe if you guys put your hand up, I can bring the mic over to you.
How can we learn more about the discussion paper?
So the discussion paper is available online. I actually tweeted about it today. So if you go to my Twitter account, you'll see that I retweeted a link to it. So you can find it there. And you can also talk to Matthew, who worked on it, and is now on the other side, so he can give us all the dirty details. Go ahead.
Ontario.ca/data strategy is the shortcut for information about strategy and then discussion.
Yeah, and I think okay, there's one thing is like, it's hard to be very engaged. One of the criticisms that I think is justified that's been put out there is that it's hard to engage back as a stakeholder because it's not really clear what the government is actually contemplating in terms of changes. The questions in the consultation document are very broad. So you might find yourself being like, whoa, this is a lot to take in. I'm not even sure where to start. On the other hand, I think it's incumbent on people in particular with a lot of technical data skills to engage in this conversation because that's a great resource for the government to tap right now in understanding what some of the risks are in this space. Now, maybe the whole process is just engagement washing and actually they don't care what you think. That's definitely a possibility. It would not be the first time that a government's done that. But at least if we can get these things on the record, we can't say we didn't say so. And there's room to continue to hold the government to account for some of these changes. It's only it's like short too. It's like a 15-page document, which I really appreciate. As you know, these things can be longer and that makes it harder to engage.
We can also share the link on Slack.
I shared it on Slack.
Perfect. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, that's great. I went to one of the data strategy at Gresham, and then they sent back this new site called Engage On. So it's engage.ontario.ca where
Yeah.
you can access the discussion paper and participate now. And I think there are a few more of these sessions. One I went to was very good in terms of the caliber of the people around the table. But I guess having worked in government for 17 years, and having gone through several policy horizontal exercises, the big challenge would be, for example, around the Great Lakes, I'm looking at that, so stuff that's happening on that. And they have to coordinate like across 30 departments and 8 ministries. So not only is it an issue of public servants having a skill set and they don't have the software to be able to find out across all those big data sets what they can use to design policy. It's just how do you begin to coordinate across? It's very hard from the start.
Yeah, and so I think on this question of how do you coordinate, that's partially why the Act is an interesting approach, because it creates this chief digital and data officer at the center of government who, at least legislatively, has the power to compel departments to move on to common standards. There's also, and part of that is then contemplating changes to whole of government policy on things like IT procurement, communications policy, policies on sort of data management and privacy. So your point though about like how do you coordinate government to make these changes is like been one of the big challenges of digital transformation so far in the state, is that we've organized government into these silos for very good reasons in some cases, but coordinating the complexity of a massive bureaucracy is like herding cats. So in theory, it gives this digital and data officer an incredible amount of power, legal power to compel ministries to simply make changes they wouldn't otherwise. And that's, I think, the mechanism. If I was a minister in another department, I would read this act and be like, whoa, you are suddenly imposing a ton of central directives on me and legal liabilities. Just keep in mind that like the minister of those other ministries is legally accountable for implementing this law and responding to it, lest they be subject to judicial review. And they've been given no new resources to do it and no guidance. And they might say, well, my ministry, the approach you're taking doesn't make sense, given my stakeholders, given the policy challenges I face. So that's another big one, is that I think the jury's still out on whether central directives make sense, or do we need to have variation in approaches to digital and data across a government? That might actually be more optimal.
If anyone hasn't read Medium articles, then you want to learn more about this topic. It's very concise, very, very informative. But one question from the Act, it said that the Ontario government promised to improve the top 10 most used service Ontario transactions. Do you know if there's any, if they've identified what those 10 transactions are? What they mean, do you have any insight into what those?
Matthew, is it written somewhere what they are and how they were calculated? So just so everybody knows, the question was that one of the first duties of this act will be to like digitize the top 10 most used Ontario service transactions.
I don't know, so I'm not speaking officially. I'm not even a government employee anymore, but I'm not sure whether it's written in detail anywhere. The news release announcing it would probably be the best place to go, but by volume is really what they're looking at. So most used services by volume, by transaction volume.
And this has been a common strategy of digital service transformation, is sort of like start with the ones that will make the most impact, in part to sort of like get the public on board, because they can supposedly see the changes right away. I mean, it raises the question of whether you're dealing in some cases with like maybe the highest volume but least impact in terms of social change, but there's a trade-off there. Like you could be maybe just improving permits, a boring permit, or like paying for tickets or something.
One of the services I was thinking about is FOI, freedom of information. How do you see this act theoretically change the whole FOI and the ability for the whole government to be more digital? So FOI would be even more complex.
Interestingly, in the budget bill, there was also changes made to the freedom of information information legislation at play in the Ontario government. Now, I haven't dug too deeply into those policy changes because, again, there was just like a lot to take in on the digital side. But yeah, I think your point is an interesting one. Like, as more and more government becomes digital, how do we manage that in terms of the? I mean, arguably, you could make the freedom of information process move more efficiently because you could be archiving things and proactively disclosing as you go. But that demands a whole other commitment to being open and transparent, which I don't see as part of the policy objectives right now of most digital reforms, which is kind of an interesting transition away from the early vehicle for digital government was like open government branding, and now it's more efficiencies and service improvements. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but what does the public think? How do we engage the public? How do we do this ethically and equitably? Fell off the radar, which is potentially going to be the Achilles heel of the digital crew. Because as you, again, I think you can't, like case after case, we're seeing that governments can't just push these changes through without finding out what people think and want and respecting that, which is part of what open government is about, right? Transparently and openly engaging the public to justify policy changes. So I think the governments that will succeed in the next like 10, 20 years as sort of the digital leaders will be the ones that on the one hand are thinking ambitiously about how data can be used and how they can design and transform services to be more digital friendly, but also doing so in a way that means they respect people's preferences, that they are thinking carefully about procedural fairness, equity. That actually might mean that they move more slowly. Their services might be worse than what you would get in a more whizzy jurisdiction, but like some of the digital leaders globally are countries that I wouldn't want to live in terms of civil liberty protections. So if it means that my service is slightly less snappy than what I'd get in Singapore, but I have faith that my government respects my human rights, I'm probably going to go with that, you know. And that's why, again, some of these global rankings of digital services are, to me, very unhelpful because, like, I don't really care what's happening in Denmark or Estonia or Singapore or China in terms of, well, I mean, I care because it's interesting to know and whatever, but like, do I really care if I'm third place behind them or 10th behind them? There's very different approaches to digital rights in some of these other jurisdictions, and I think we have to be thinking more carefully about what works in our system and given our expectations and our values.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the response. I was wondering, with these policies, like the city policies and data, are they symbiotic in terms of nature that this Ontario government's digital strategy would it encourage City of Toronto and other cities, other municipalities to be more innovative, or will they start with their innovation in terms of data strategy?
So this is again where there's a lot of gray area about what the Act could actually mean in practice, but it does talk in the Act about the Chief Digital and Data Officer setting standards and advising or setting best practices basically for a whole range of public sector organizations that are not strictly, that are governed through the Ontario government or related or affiliated with the government, but not in kind of core Ontario ministry that we would think about. So yeah, municipalities are in there, local health integration networks, school boards. I mean, this is where, again, the vast scope of this law is like overwhelming and I think should be throwing us all for a loop. To be sure, from what I read, the actual legislative powers to compel, say, a data release or a certain approach to governing data as an asset, it seems to be restricted to those kind of core public sector organizations, but it still does implicate all these other actors. Hospitals are in there, like it's pretty wild actually. And again, it's like, hasn't made any waves, in part because, I mean, we do have a bit of a problem where I think our legislatures are not particularly attuned to and paying attention to these digital questions. You can get away with quite a lot actually as a government if you want, because the opposition, it's not a sexy issue that gets the average Canadian up in arms right now. Until I think we have a big splashy failure, a big policy scandal might mean that you get more scrutiny of these questions in a big way at Queen's Park, let's say.
So maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll be around afterwards. If there's any more folks that want to approach you one-on-one.
Question, not a comment, definitely. Just that people are worried about that. So you've written about in a great article in 2017 that there's been a policy transfer between jurisdictions that have created digital government units. You know, the GDS in the UK, 18F in the USPS in the United States, you're talking now about a lack of sort of democratic process here. I wonder whether, as a public administration academic, you've looked at, I'm sure, many different policy issues where there's multiple sides to a coin, multiple sides of performing your social services programs, for instance, and saying this is what an ideal system or an ideal set of reforms ought to look like. But we don't really see that quite so much in the digital space. We don't see a lot of politicization or a lot of different directions that we might go in. So I wonder whether you might be able to give some perspectives on what you think might be missing there. If it's a lack of engagement or something else that might be missing. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the kind of orthodoxy that's at play in this piece of legislation and that drives things like the creation of the Ontario Digital Service, the Canadian Digital Service, 18F. I mean, it was taken for granted, it's been taken for granted as kind of gospel truth that this is the way you transform government for the digital age, is by focusing on design, user research, cutting out hierarchy, limiting silos, creating centers of power to compel the rest of government to take certain approaches to digital. And the truth is, we have very little data to suggest that those approaches are working at all. In fact, early lessons from some of the jurisdictions that moved quickly in this space suggest that they actually can be large-scale failures. There's lots of pushback from the rest of government. It's easy to tackle the low-hanging fruits, which is usually where these units start. They kind of find like certain use case, like certain services that would be easily fixed through these approaches, and then they do those to kind of show off. But then when you get to the thornier questions, it's like, oh, maybe we actually need to kind of revert back in some cases to more traditional policy lenses, to more traditional approaches to government, to engaging the public beyond their interaction with the service as just a user, but rather finding out their values and preferences. So it is concerning that the transfer has happened so quickly with little evidence that it makes sense, which is why it's nice. It would be nice to see things moving more slowly. Why has it moved so quickly? I mean, in part because I think there's been a very eager kind of instrument constituency, which is a term used to kind of describe a group of people who advocate for certain policy approaches to spread because they have a personal interest in it. So there's private sector consultants who used to work in government who now tour around the world and push the GDS model. There's also actually a lot of this stuff can weirdly be pushed by tech firms who are kind of pushing their approach to government as kind of a solution to government's problems. Then I think also there's politicians. This can be a kind of it's an appealing narrative to sell them that if you borrow practice from the private sector and just hire a bunch of tech talent, that you can like solve all these long-standing problems in government, which clearly is like far too simplistic and not helpful. So that's, I think, part of why it's been pushed, and we may very well find that in the next 5-10 years, this idea of creating a digital state by pushing through reforms like this act, or creating digital service teams, that was actually a poor investment and that we acted too quickly. So evaluation would be a big one, and I think open and honest evaluation by the teams who are actually doing this work would be great. The problem is, of course, there's a bit of a conflict of interest there because clearly they want to justify their jobs. So outside scrutiny again from folks like yourselves, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my work, I think is helpful. And I will also give a shout out to the people leading these teams because I do think that they have their hearts in the right place. They are very thoughtful about the complexities of changing government. They're not so naive in thinking that you just throw a law at it, or you throw new data, or you throw new talent. Of course not. I mean, some of the most impressive public servants I've met in my research are working in the digital space and have a really acute and thoughtful appreciation for the challenges of governing relative to some of the digital challenges in the private sector, which are like how do we get people to click on this more? At the same time, they're often to get money, to get buy-in from their minister, pushing these more simplistic narratives, which is a bit of a problem, I think.
Okay, thank you. And if you do have more questions, Amanda will be around for a bit, but we are going to move to the next part of Hacknight.